Hello there. Welcome to this afternoon's video. I'm Phil Browning-Helsel with Austin Seminary, and I'm talking to you today about a book called When Christ's Body is Broken by Leanna Fuller. Let me show you that book. The subtitle here is Anxiety, Identity, and Conflict in Congregations, and it's from 2016 from Wipfenstock. And I'd like to talk with you about each of the chapters today. The first chapter is called, What's the Problem? Understanding Church Conflict. Number 2 is What Do Churches Fight About? Number 3, Why is Difference So Threatening? Number 4, Why Do Group Identities Matter? Number 5, Where is God in all this? And number 6, What can conflicted congregations do? So I'll take you through the chapters of the book. And we'll talk about some of her key ideas. First, let me just emphasize, I really find this to be a helpful book and one of the only books in pastoral care on the topic of congregational conflict in the last several years, which I think is remarkable in itself. She says that church conflict is seldom studied in pastoral care, even though it's common. So 23% of churches had a conflict in the last couple of years, and 26.4 had them bad enough to lose members. 45% said it was significant enough to convene a special body or to call for outside help. That's from page 3. So the areas that congregations typically had conflict in were worship, finances, leadership, or program. One of Fuller's key ideas is that all conflicts include a theological dimension. And this got me thinking, maybe fighting in church is itself a theological act. She says that when religious bodies make promises to one another, they also become conflicted. And she says one of the most common causes is the loss of community members. So what's out there right now to study congregational conflict? Well, it's mostly leadership studies, and that is just lacks a thick description, which her book provides. So leadership studies is what people are using to address conflict, but it doesn't deal adequately with what's going on inside people and in relationship with one another as they go through conflict. It's not as rich as a pastoral care study, for example. It's more, leadership studies tend to be just how to do things. So one of the central ideas of the book from the subtitle is this notion of anxiety and how anxiety is related to a community's sense of identity. Okay, so what do churches fight about? Chapter 2. That's what we're going to look at now. What do churches fight about? She uses 2 case studies. The first case study is a church that's fighting about homosexuality. And this is one where she is one of the pastors involved. And so the church, the denomination has changed its stance, and the church gets into conflict about this. Many church members leave, leaders leave, and money is withheld. And this is what she calls Grace United Church of Christ. One of the things she notices that as the church tries to talk about the conflict, it gets heated and people leave. So actually talking about the conflict doesn't always help, was one of my major takeaways from this book. Or talking about it in certain ways, in undisciplined ways. 25% of the church of 250 left. One thing she says is that people who tended to want to stay in the church tended to do so out of loyalty to the pastors, and not particularly because they agreed with the denomination stance. This was several years ago when this happened. A bunch of meetings didn't make things easier. In fact, it tended to make them worse. Meetings seemed to get more intense with anxiety, and the lighthearted banter gave way to a serious silence. This got me kind of wondering as I was reading her book about differences in conflict between changes that arise from within a congregation and then changes that come from decisions that a denomination might make. She defines anxiety, central to her project, as the general sense of threat that causes persons to feel unsafe in the world. And a perceived, I'll say that again, anxiety for her is a general sense of threat that causes a person to feel unsafe in the world, from page 49. Perceived threats to identity cause anxiety that's hard to relieve. This is a really important point. And she emphasizes 4 different aspects of anxiety at this point: theological dimensions of conflict, identity, polarization, and fragmentation, and then the pain of conflict and change. And then she also presents another church, a United Methodist Church, that has a series of ongoing conflicts about worship. This church made me wonder about conflict and worship being kind of a theological act. So is conflict about worship kind of a theological act in itself? So the big question for these 2 communities is, how can somebody be a part of a worshiping body but still disagree theologically with me? Leaving the denomination seemed fraught for some of these churchgoers. And she was noticing too that theological dimensions of the worship style frequently came up in conversation. So the worship space itself was an intimate part of worship. And some people experience certain kinds of worship as like being directly related to God or directly communicating with God. And at the UMC church, where they had this conflict about worship services, they were trying to decide about 2 different worship services, one traditional and one more contemporary. And the people who believed in the contemporary service talked about God's immanence, talked about God being uniquely present within the church community. So for people in a conflict, pretty quickly we start touching on identity. So what's the person's identity and how does it relate to the conflict that's unfolding? For some people, it's a denominational identity, although maybe less and less so. For some people, the denomination was like a family, and so it was hard to think about leaving. For some people, it was a theme of being a welcoming church around the UCC church with the conflict about homosexuality, which is the word she uses in this book. In the worship-conflicted congregation, people would say, I am a contemporary worshiper rather than I prefer contemporary worship. So clearly, being identified with this particular part of a congregation became important to people's sense of self. An early morning person, a contemporary worship service person, a traditional worship person. She talks about polarization, so this tendency to split into factions once the lines had been drawn. Once somebody became a part of a group in her study, they never went back over. So this is such a crucial point, I think, from her study. People painted themselves into a corner, essentially, they felt like, and then in order to save face, they had to leave, was kind of how they described it. So people's identification with their group, whether it be a particular kind of theology, a particular kind of view of human sexuality, began quite early and stayed strong. And often there were long-term consequences for this. At the UCC church that split over the homosexuality decision, people in the community didn't know each other after the split. So it created community-wide rifts from the congregation's conflict. One person says, quote, "At stake was the loss of some very good church workers and friends. We were very careful about talking about the issue," end quote, on page 62. Grief and anger responses were pretty common here. And there were different kinds of anxiety that were produced by encounters with difference, Fuller says. Some anxiety was acute in response to a specific danger, and some anxiety was chronic, prolonged, and it tended to be generalized and diffuse. Here's a quote from Fuller, page 64. "High levels of chronic anxiety within an organization tend to create more intensely emotional responses to anxiety-producing events. So you picture the level of anxiety in a group heightening, and then you're probably going to see more intense emotional responses to events. And she describes chronically anxious congregations as reactive and having some particular behaviors as a result of reactivity: secrecy, accusations, deceit, triangulation. Triangulation is when somebody won't talk to somebody else, they talk to a third person, and complaining. At the UCC church that she describes, the anxiety turned into broken relationships. So chapter 3, why is difference so threatening? This is our psychological chapter. So Fuller engages psychodynamic psychology to help us understand anxiety as a basic threat to one's sense of selfhood. On page 69, she calls it that. Differences in individuals cause them to experience threats to the self differently. And she talks about a couple of key psychological ideas. One is splitting. And splitting is when you have a pathological response to unwanted memory that makes it hard for you to hold that in your mind. And splitting occurs when you have all good or all bad images of someone in your mind. So you can't think of them as ambiguous in some ways. They become the people with the pointy hats or the dunce caps. A certain group becomes entirely one kind of characteristic. So she discusses how early relationships have a long-lasting impression on us. We carry around our loved ones from our earliest years in ourselves, and our relationships with those early caregivers continue to impact how we respond to anxiety and how we think of it impacting the self. So we have in our minds a mental representation of early caregivers, say a mother or father, or a foster mother or father. And then we also have a mental representation of ourself. Who are you when you think of yourself? And so there's a narrow kind of self-representation that are stored in memory, imagined images of the future self. And then there's broad associated self-representations. And these could be groups to which one belongs. So you could think of yourself as a Christian, and what associations come to mind as you think of yourself that way. Those could be kind of odd, what you might call self-representations. So splitting is when you discern a difference between yourself and an object or something that you care about. And so splitting is, in a sense, a neutral term. But when splitting becomes bad, it becomes a polarized quality of all good or all bad. So she refers to some early psychological thinking that shows how infants might have a really good or really bad experience, and it's a total experience. So they can't kind of distinguish between their world. And what happens then sometimes is an infant can't handle the bad feelings, and so they take those bad feelings and put them outside onto something else or someone else. So if it's bad splitting, then the bad parts of the self are put outside onto someone else in a kind of defensive way. So if there's something in yourself that feels really threatening to you, then you push it outside of yourself, and that bad person out there becomes the container for all the things that you want to disown in yourself. So if somebody's always complaining about someone else that really bothers them, often it's because it reminds them of some part of themselves that's disowned, that they haven't completely incorporated. So if I can't tolerate the idea that I'm sick or arrogant or lazy, I'll split that off and project it into someone else. And so people naturally create one another by putting these positive or negative aspects onto others. So that creates people as kind of needy or you feel enslaved to them for your life. And so this occurs if it's really unhealthy, it occurs unconsciously, and people do it without noticing it. And it's kind of a constant feature of their life and their conversation. They always seem to be complaining. And if you look long enough, the complaining seems to have something to do with who they see themselves being. It's a result of how they're relating to themselves. Fuller says this happens in groups too. So there's collective splitting when you put all the good or bad qualities onto a whole group. So that group becomes the enemy then. And it happens sometimes in groups that can't tolerate any opposition to the ideology shared by the majority of their members. And so they then kind of create someone who gathers all the good or bad qualities of the group and becomes a scapegoat. And then that easily splits into subgroups that fight one another. Here's my favorite understatement of the book. On page 80, Fuller says, "The complexity and emotional depth of other participants in the conflict are occasionally lost," end quote. That seems to be an understatement. So what happens when splitting and projection take place at the group level is that everybody starts to caricature one another, and you can't really see what they care about, or you can't see them as people. So that's the result of polarization in a group. People start to seem like caricatures or one-dimensional images of themselves. So the enemy ceases to be a person, but just a force opposed to the self. And this is a result. So sometimes in this dynamic of scapegoating, disturbing feelings are then put on some group members and unconsciously projected onto an individual. And this is a way of protecting a person from the scary feelings that they have inside themselves. And so then you start to see conflicts split into all good or all bad subgroups. These tend to be situations where people are looking for someone to blame. Members project what's unwanted in themselves into a member who's often already marked in some way as different or other. So interestingly, group memberships are often a part of one's own self-representation. And either or thinking is a form of splitting. What happens when you have a scapegoat? Well, then you can't see the scapegoat's own feelings, longings, and intentions any longer. They seem like just a caricature to you. So scapegoating has a cartoony feeling and a flat, simplistic entity. You can see this sometimes in the names that people use to describe one another in the conflict. Because of the denomination's resolution, in this case of the UCC church, where the denomination made a decision that then was responded to by the congregation, people saw negative elements in their group identity that caused them to split off that identity from themselves. So then they were no longer, because they disagreed with the denomination's decision about gay and lesbian inclusion, they then thought of themselves as no longer having that UCC part of themselves. They split off that identity from themselves, and that whole denominational part had to go. But Fuller does a nice job pointing out that everybody in the church had more complex feelings about the issue than for or against a certain vote. And parishioners, what she noticed especially was certain parishioners seemed to have a hard time tolerating theological complexity within their pastoral leaders. And the congregation began to see, here's the moment of doom. The congregation began to see the conflict as a game with only one possible winner. Let's compare this quickly to the Methodist church that had the conflict arising from itself about the worship service. In this instance, members went into this decision-making process, contemporary versus traditional, with an inclination to fight for one side of their particular service, and to convince the whole group that their group was the best. So they were kind of identified with their group identity from the beginning. When each subgroup kind of feels a need to advocate for its own survival, then you might be in a situation of collective splitting for Fuller. One key question is, when is a person's identification with the whole congregation more important than their identification with one particular group in a conflict? And that's usually a sign of less of a basic threat to selfhood. So in a group setting, members divide the community into smaller and smaller subgroups as a means, Fuller says, of protecting themselves against anxiety. So that's page 90. So conflict can be a way of actually protecting the self from anxiety. She has a great description of how we have needs to kind of hold up and elevate someone in our community that's above us, that's perfect, and then we can kind of belong to that idealized self. So a basic feeling of belonging to a group can help someone feel sustained when they are in a foreign or unusual environment. So we all have very deep needs to be held in community by others, and these needs to be held actually reinforce some of the earliest childhood needs where we were held together as infants and young children. These needs actually continue into adulthood as we engage with groups. And you can feel those needs coming out when people rigidly insist that others feel and think exactly as they do, or experience panic and rage when others fail to be exactly like them. She talks about on page 95. So when people start to feel like someone is not aware of that self, they start to disintegrate because they kind of lack what they feel like is empathy. That empathy is that basic psychic oxygen in a community. And when that happens to a lot of people in community, chronic anxiety within the organization kind of heightens. And Fuller says that heightening results in everybody needing everyone else to be the same. I was wondering, is this archaic need for sameness an explanation of why people become and stay polarized? And she wonders if people were just against something and not together on the same thing. And she says that these needs for togetherness and these anxiety needs show up regardless, even in people who are otherwise healthy during times of stress. She notices that in each of these cases, there's a loss involved, a potential loss. And with the worship services, it's a deep loss, a need for those similar to us, our mini tribe, our contemporary worshipers, our traditional worshipers. And so acknowledging that loss can be an important part of this journey as well. So I was wondering a couple of things as I come to the end of this third chapter, Why is Difference So Threatening? And I'm going to pause the video here, and then I'll come back to the sociological chapters and the responses afterwards in a separate video. But I was wondering in this section about why is difference so threatening? I was wondering what made Fuller think that the UCC conflict that she experienced was simply destructive, or if there were any redemptive elements in that conflict at all. And I wonder if different voices who emerge from that conflict might have different stakes on that. I also wondered, do people who've seen a lot of conflict in their families of origin then end up recreating it in their worship place or their church community? And if her description in this psychological section describes some of that as well. So let's continue with this conversation about Fuller's work, When Christ's Body is Broken, in a few minutes. And we'll pause it there at the end of her third chapter and have a detailed discussion of the rest of the book soon.